Viewer discretion advised. Images are used for illustration purposes only. She said she didn't know what medication was. She was 17, but looked 10. It was 5:49 a.m. in Paris, California, a quiet neighborhood wrapped in early morning silence when a single 911 call would crack open one of the darkest cases of child abuse in American history. If you believe a single voice can shake the silence of the world, subscribe now. If you don't, explain in the comments why you've chosen the comfort of silence over the weight of truth. The girl's voice trembled. It was weak but determined, as if every syllable cost her courage she had been saving for years. "My two little sisters right now are chained up," she whispered into the phone. "They're chained up to their bed." The dispatcher on the line stayed composed, but her heart raced. The caller, a teenage girl, sounded barely alive. Her words were strange, like they came from someone who hadn't interacted with the outside world in years. She didn't know her own address. She didn't know what the word bruise meant. She said she had never been to a doctor, never been to school. This was no ordinary runaway call, and this was no ordinary family. The call that changed everything. That girl's name was Jordan Turpin, 17 years old, and she had just escaped the house on Muirwoods Road through a window. Her hands shook as she held a deactivated phone she had secretly charged over several days, using it for the first time in her life to call 911. She had never spoken to a stranger before. She didn't even know if the police would believe her. But she did it anyway. In that moment, Jordan became the voice for her 12 siblings, children who had spent their entire lives shackled in a nightmare that defies understanding. And as her words trickled into the Riverside County Emergency Dispatch Center, something far more disturbing was about to unravel. A home that looked normal from the outside. When officers arrived at the beige suburban home, nothing seemed off. It was eerily clean. A few weeds in the front yard, cars in the driveway, curtains drawn. Just another quiet household on a California street. But when they knocked, the illusion shattered. Inside, they found something straight out of a horror novel. The air reeked of rot and human waste. Dirty diapers and moldy food littered the floor. Beds were stained and rusted, some with metal chains hanging from them. Thin, frail children with pale skin and wide, terrified eyes stood frozen like ghosts. Some couldn't even speak. They had been taught their whole lives to be silent. One officer later admitted, "I've seen a lot in my career, but this was pure evil." The Turpin family. A twisted web. David and Louise Turpin. The parents were both present, calm, polite, confused why officers were there. They looked like a typical couple from a photo album. Louise wore her long brown hair down her back, dressed modestly. David, bespectacled and soft-spoken, smiled weakly. But appearances lie. In the garage, police found a chain on a bedpost and shackles near piles of soiled laundry. Some of the children aged 2 to 29 were so malnourished they couldn't walk. One 12-year-old weighed as little as a 7-year-old. The 29-year-old daughter? She weighed just 82 pounds. Many had stunted growth, muscle atrophy, and rotting teeth. They had been starved, isolated, beaten, and denied medical care for years. And yet, none of the neighbors knew. Silence in the neighborhood. When news broke the following day, neighbors were shocked. "I used to see the kids marching in circles at night through the window," one local said. "I thought they were just very religious or homeschooled." Another neighbor mentioned, "They never came out. We never saw them, but the house was always quiet. We thought maybe they just liked their privacy." That privacy had become a prison, and behind those beige walls, a secret world of cruelty had thrived for over a decade. Who could have known? The shocking truth wasn't just that the abuse happened, it's that it happened so invisibly. The Turpins had once appeared on television, smiling at Disneyland with all 13 kids. They had social media accounts, posed in matching outfits, even renewed wedding vows in Las Vegas, while the children clapped obediently. It was a carefully constructed illusion, one that even fooled relatives, who said they were strict but loving parents. But behind the social media smiles were nights filled with starvation, torture, and emotional warfare. The children were denied showers for months, forbidden to speak, fed once a day, if at all, punished for washing their hands, punished for playing with each other, and above all, taught to never trust anyone outside. But Jordan had dared to believe there was an outside world and that it might help, the beginning of the end. That morning, as officers began removing the children from the house, one by one with blankets wrapped around their emaciated bodies, the truth finally began to surface. The children didn't understand what police were. They didn't know what medicine was. Some couldn't spell their own names, and yet they were still hopeful because Jordan had made the call. "She saved all of us," one of her sisters would later say in court. "She gave us life." The Untold Trace begins. This is not just another case of abuse. It is a warped fairy tale of hidden suffering, playing out silently in modern-day suburbia unseen by the world. But here, on The Untold Trace, we expose what others overlook. We shine a light on the unspeakable, not to horrify, but to awaken. Because somewhere out there, another Jordan may be waiting, looking out the window, wondering if the world outside can hear her. And it must. Stay with us as we take you deeper into the house of pain, the minds of the monsters, and the long road to justice. You've only just begun to hear the untold truth. It wasn't a home, it was a tomb with living corpses. First responder on the scene. To anyone walking past 160 Muir Woods Road in Paris, California, the house looked painfully ordinary. Beige siding, drawn curtains, a minivan parked in the driveway. It was the kind of house you'd walk by and forget a second later. But behind that front door was a secret so horrifying that even seasoned officers would later confess they had trouble sleeping afterward. What they found was not just neglect, it was deliberate cruelty, carefully hidden behind the image of a wholesome suburban family. The home was not a shelter, it was a prison, the smell of suffering. The first red flag wasn't what officers saw, it was what they smelled. The air inside was thick with the stench of rot, human waste, mold, and decay. It was the smell of abandonment, not of a place, but of people. As they stepped further into the house, they found rooms filled with filth. Garbage was piled in corners, dirty diapers were left on the floor, dried stains of unknown origin clung to walls and furniture. And yet in the middle of the chaos, there were children. Children with wide, empty eyes. Children who didn't speak. Children who flinched at the sound of footsteps. Chains in darkness. In the back bedrooms, things got even worse. There were metal bed frames with padlocks and chains still attached. One of the beds had two small sets of chains, where officers believed two of the youngest girls had been shackled. The bedding was stained and reeked of urine. The windows had been blacked out with thick, sun-faded curtains that hadn't been drawn in years. One child had been found chained to their bed for weeks. They didn't know what day it was. They barely understood what was happening. They just stood there expressionless as strangers walked in and freed them. This was routine for them. Being chained, being ignored, being invisible, hunger as control. The kitchen was almost pristine, shockingly so. The fridge was full of food. There were frozen meals, pies, sauces, snacks, but none of it was for the children. The Turpin children were allowed one small meal a day, often a slice of bread with peanut butter. They weren't allowed to drink cold water. They were not permitted to eat without permission, even when their stomachs ached with hunger. If they disobeyed, the punishment was swift and cruel: chains, beatings, or starvation. One of the daughters said they would sometimes eat ketchup packets or ice cubes to survive. Another said she had dug into the trash when no one was watching. This wasn't poverty, it was a system of control through deprivation. Denied basic hygiene. Showers were allowed once a year. The children often went months without cleaning themselves. Their hair was matted, their skin was dry and cracked. Several had lice infestations so bad that clumps of hair had fallen out. Most of them had severe dental issues, including tooth decay, gum infections, and exposed nerves. One girl had never seen a toothbrush in her life. Some were so weak from malnutrition and inactivity that they couldn't walk upright. Muscles had atrophied. Their bodies had physically shriveled under years of abuse. Some doctors described them as having the bone density of elderly adults. The homeschooling cover. The parents claimed they were homeschooling their children. David Turpin even registered their home as a private school under the name Sandcastle Day School. But when authorities spoke with the children, it was clear they were barely literate. Some didn't know the alphabet. Others didn't understand basic arithmetic. Several didn't even know what the police were or how to spell their own names. They weren't being educated. They were being hidden. Siblings raising siblings. Because the parents were either absent or abusive, the children leaned on each other for survival. The older ones taught the younger ones how to eat slowly so they wouldn't get sick. They passed on what little they remembered about the world. They whispered bedtime songs, even though they barely remembered the lyrics. Jordan, the 17-year-old who escaped and called 911, had learned about life outside through a smuggled phone. She secretly watched music videos and dance routines online, wondering what it would feel like to have freedom, love, and light. Her small window into the outside world became a lifeline and eventually a plan. The social media illusion. In one corner of the living room hung a large family photo, all 15 members smiling in identical outfits. The kind of photo that screams, "We are happy, we are blessed." They even had Facebook accounts filled with cheerful posts. Family vacations to Disneyland, matching costumes, renewed wedding vows, carefully curated memories. But they were all a smokescreen. The photos were staged, the smiles were forced. The happy image was a wall meant to protect the Turpin parents from suspicion, and it worked for years. No one knew what was happening inside that house. Not the neighbors, not distant relatives, not even government agencies. The chains, the hunger, the beatings, they all happened in secret. The realization. When officers pieced it all together, the chains, the decay, the silence, it became clear. This wasn't just abuse. It was calculated psychological torture, a hidden hellscape that had gone unnoticed for over a decade. What haunted them most wasn't the condition of the house, it was the condition of the children. Not just their physical weakness, but their emotional numbness. Their inability to cry, their hesitation to speak, their complete lack of understanding about the world. It wasn't just a house of pain. It was a house without hope. Closing. As this chapter of the story closes, we move forward to the part that will shatter even the hardest hearts. The personal stories of the victims, what they endured, how they survived, and the pain they still carry. These are not just case files. They are human lives. And the most heartbreaking truth? This wasn't centuries ago. This wasn't far away. It happened here, in our time, on our watch. We were robbed of our lives, but we're still here. Survivor testimony. The world now knew what was hidden inside the walls of 160 Muirwoods Road, but the house was only the setting. The real story, the one that should be burned into history, is the story of the 13 children who lived through it. They weren't just victims. They were survivors of something most of us can't even imagine. And despite the torment, they were still capable of love, resilience, and hope. 13 lives in captivity. There were 7 adult children and 6 minors, ranging from just 2 years old to 29. But if you looked at them, you'd think they were all much younger. A 17-year-old who looked 10. A 29-year-old who weighed just 82 pounds. Their growth had been stunted by years of malnutrition, isolation, and neglect. Some of them didn't even know what age was, because birthdays were never celebrated. In fact, they didn't even know what day or month it was. Holidays didn't exist in their world. There were no Christmas mornings, no birthday cakes, no bedtime stories. Only chains, silence, and pain. One sibling testified, "I didn't know what love was. I thought hitting and starving was normal. I didn't know other families were different." Stolen childhood, stolen minds. Many of the children had never played before. Simple things, running, jumping, laughing, were foreign concepts. They had never stepped foot in a school. They had never gone to a park. Some had never even seen another child besides their siblings. Because of this, their mental and emotional development was severely affected. Therapists said that some of them spoke in a strange, robotic manner, like they were reading from a script. Others would freeze when asked simple questions, unsure if speaking would bring punishment. They had no concept of trust. And yet they craved human connection more than anything. One of the younger boys, after being rescued, kept asking his nurse, "Am I allowed to talk now?" The pain beneath the skin. What medical staff uncovered was beyond alarming. Several of the children had severe muscle wasting, meaning their limbs had started deteriorating due to lack of movement and nutrition. Some could not walk without assistance. Many were anemic. A few had heart damage from prolonged starvation. Their skin was thin, their eyes sunken, their teeth rotted. Their stomachs couldn't even handle regular food. Doctors had to reintroduce nutrients slowly, or they could have died from refeeding syndrome. Some children had signs of psychological trauma so severe they didn't respond to comfort. Hugs terrified them. Eye contact was avoided. They flinched at soft voices, expecting punishment in every word. And still, none of them ever turned on each other. They had survived through unity, secret journals, secret hopes. Among the few belongings seized from the home were handwritten journals, mostly from the older girls. Hidden under mattresses or tucked behind bed frames, they wrote about their pain, their confusion, and their secret dreams of escaping. Why haven't you subscribed yet? Drop a comment below and let us know what's holding you back. We'd love to hear your thoughts. One entry read, "Sometimes I imagine I'm a bird. I fly out the window and never come back." Another said, "I want to learn everything. I want to go to school. I want friends." It wasn't just a cry for help. It was a whisper of defiance. They were still thinking, still dreaming, still human despite all efforts to strip that away. The world reacts. When the news broke, people around the world were stunned. The phrase "House of Horrors" trended globally. Donations poured in, support groups formed, celebrities spoke out. Everyone wanted to help, but no one could grasp how something like this had gone on for so long, undetected. But while the world was reeling, the children were beginning their first experiences with freedom. They were moved to separate hospitals, given beds with clean sheets, showers, warm food, and for the first time, kindness. Nurses and doctors reported that the siblings thanked everyone for everything, even simple things. One nurse recalled giving a child a toy and watching them stare at it for 10 full minutes before asking, "Is this really mine?" From silence to voice. For the first time, they were able to speak. In court, years later, two of the adult children stood up trembling, voices shaking, and addressed the parents who had tortured them. One daughter said, "My parents took my whole life from me, but now I'm taking it back." A son followed, "I still love my parents, but I forgive them for myself. I want to heal." It was not weakness. It was a display of unbelievable strength. To endure all that and still choose peace, not just survival. But growth is something most of us can only aspire to. A glimmer of life. Despite everything, there were bright moments. Some of the siblings enrolled in college. Others began working regular jobs. One of the sisters learned to ride a bike for the first time at 20. Another got her first birthday cake at 22. There were field trips, friendships, volunteer work, therapy sessions, group hugs. They were discovering the world slowly, painfully, but together. One counselor described it best. "It's like watching someone see color for the first time. But healing isn't easy." Not all the news was good. A 2021 investigation revealed that several of the Turpin children were later placed in foster homes where they were abused again, a devastating irony. Some were denied access to the money donated for their care. Others were re-traumatized by the system that was supposed to protect them. They looked like average parents, but the evil they orchestrated was anything but average. Investigator on the case. For more than 2 decades, David and Louise Turpin lived behind closed curtains in quiet suburban neighborhoods. They smiled for photos, renewed their vows in Las Vegas, dressed their 13 children in identical outfits. They appeared quirky, maybe overprotective, but harmless. But beneath the surface was a rot that ran deep, one rooted not just in cruelty, but in control, obsession, and delusion. In this section, we turn our lens toward the perpetrators, The people who were supposed to protect these children, love them, raise them, but instead inflicted one of the worst cases of sustained abuse ever uncovered in the United States. David and Louise Turpin, the facade of family. David Allen Turpin, born in 1961, and Louise Anna Turpin, born in 1968, were by all accounts an average couple when they first met. They married in 1985 when Louise was just 16 years old. David was a computer engineer. Louise was a homemaker. They moved frequently, living in Texas before settling in California. Their backgrounds were not particularly criminal or violent. To friends and neighbors, they seemed a little odd, perhaps introverted, perhaps overly religious, but nothing to suggest they were capable of monstrous behavior. Louise posted on Facebook. She loved dressing the kids in identical clothing for photos. David held a job with Lockheed Martin and later Northrop Grumman. They made enough money to support their large family, yet their home slowly decayed into squalor. So where did it all go wrong? The psychology of control. Investigators and psychologists who studied the Turpins described their behavior not just as abusive, but ritualistic. David and Louise had developed their own twisted version of family life, where they alone were gods. The children were not allowed to make decisions, speak freely, or even move without permission. They weren't allowed to play. They weren't allowed to learn. They were broken down emotionally, physically, and mentally over years until all that remained was submission. Louise, in particular, was described as the central enforcer. Though David was the patriarch, it was Louise who often decided when children would be punished, who would be shackled, and how long they'd go without food. She ruled with a strange combination of religious fanaticism and personal insecurity. At times, she seemed completely detached from reality. Isolation as a weapon. One of the most dangerous tools in their arsenal was isolation. From the very beginning, David and Louise ensured their children had no outside influence. No school, no church, despite their religious references, no playdates, no doctor visits, no contact with the world. The few times they left the house for staged public outings or vacations, the children were told to stay quiet, smile, and follow precise instructions. The outings were never about fun. They were about illusion, maintaining an image for family and social media, while hiding their private reign of terror. They lived a life that was choreographed and manufactured. Even photos were taken with military-like order. Stand still, wear this, smile. Behind the smiles was silence, fear, hunger, family red flags that were missed. Some family members suspected something wasn't right. Louise's own sister admitted they were never allowed to visit the home. Phone calls were limited. The children were always sick, sleeping, or studying. Whenever someone got too close, the Turpins would move to a new city or state. David's parents told reporters they believed the couple had a strict religious lifestyle. They thought the children were being homeschooled as part of a God's calling, but they never pressed further. One of Louise's siblings later confessed, "I thought she was strict. I didn't think she was evil." The lack of oversight from relatives, neighbors, and public institutions created the perfect storm. For over 20 years, the Turpins thrived in secrecy, unchecked, unchallenged, and undisturbed. From Texas to California. The hidden moves. Before the Paris home, there was Rio Vista, Texas, where the abuse likely began. Neighbors there recalled odd behavior, children seen digging through trash. Lights on at 3 a.m. Furniture moved in the middle of the night. A foul smell from the house. One former neighbor said they once saw 4 pale children walking in single file, heads down in the backyard. At the time, it seemed weird. Now it seems horrifying. Even more disturbing, while in Texas, no Child Protective Services reports were ever filed. No formal inspections, no visits. They were ghosts in plain sight. When the Turpins relocated to California, the pattern continued: more secrecy, more control. The last home became the most infamous, 160 Muir Woods Road, the House of Horrors, Las Vegas vows, and Disneyland deception. Despite their actions at home, David and Louise maintained a bizarre fantasy life in public. One of their favorite rituals was renewing their wedding vows in Las Vegas. surrounded by their children dressed in matching clothes, all smiling on cue. Video footage shows Louise beaming as an Elvis impersonator performs. The children stand stiffly, clapping on command. Behind their eyes is a flat, haunting emptiness. They also took multiple trips to Disneyland. Pictures from those outings were later used as proof of family normalcy. But every photo was a lie, every laugh rehearsed. The children weren't happy, they were performing survival. The arrest, unraveling the facade. When Jordan escaped and the police stormed the house, David and Louise seemed confused. They didn't resist, they didn't panic. They just stood there polite, quiet, like nothing was wrong. David calmly unlocked the chains. Louise told officers she didn't understand the problem. That moment told investigators everything they needed to know. These people didn't think they were doing anything wrong. They had lived in their delusion for so long, they believed it was normal. They were arrested on multiple counts of torture, child cruelty, false imprisonment, and abuse of dependent adults. The media swarmed. The world was stunned, but they showed no remorse. Courtroom denial and final sentencing. In 2019, David and Louise Turpin each pleaded guilty to 14 felony counts. At their sentencing, they offered tearful apologies. David read from a written statement. Louise sobbed as she spoke of love for her children. But it wasn't enough. The judge didn't mince words. This is among the worst, most aggravated child abuse cases I've ever seen. The pain you caused may never heal. They were each sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. For many, that wasn't enough. But for the children, it was a start, a beginning to the end of their nightmare. They wore the mask of parents, but behind that mask were two architects of agony. David and Louise Turpin were not monsters in the traditional sense. They were far more dangerous. They were calculated, patient, and methodical. They created a world in which control replaced compassion and chains replaced childhood. And yet, their victims survived. We escaped the house, but we're still trying to escape the pain. Survivor testimony. Freedom is often imagined as a joyful moment, a door swinging open, chains falling off, sunlight flooding in. But for the Turpin children, freedom wasn't a finish line. It was the beginning of another kind of battle, one fought in courtrooms, therapy rooms, and within their own minds. The world saw the escape. What the world didn't see or didn't stay around to watch was what happened after. In this final chapter, we follow the 13 survivors into the years after the rescue, where hope struggled to bloom under the long shadow of trauma. First days of freedom. The night of their rescue, the Turpin children were split into age groups and taken to local hospitals. Nurses described them as gentle, polite, and fragile, as if they were afraid kindness might vanish if they moved too quickly. Doctors had to slowly reintroduce food and water. Some children were so malnourished that a full meal could have caused organ failure. Others needed surgeries to repair dental damage or orthopedic intervention from years of being confined to small spaces. But physical healing was only half the battle. Emotionally, they were lost. Some didn't understand that they were no longer prisoners. A few even asked permission to use the bathroom or speak to the nurses. One child was so unfamiliar with social interaction that he simply stared at his plate, waiting for orders. Despite it all, they thanked everyone for the smallest gestures. Thank you for the blanket. Thank you for the applesauce. Thank you for not hurting me. Trauma doesn't end with rescue. Therapists soon realized the magnitude of psychological damage. The children, especially the older ones, displayed symptoms of complex PTSD, anxiety, and emotional paralysis. Several could not sleep unless the lights were on. Some were terrified of showers, associating them with punishment. Others exhibited what psychologists call learned helplessness, a survival state where the mind stops believing that escape or change is even possible. Despite their differences in age, all of them had one thing in common. They didn't know who they were outside of captivity. They had to learn how to speak freely, how to express themselves, how to feel safe in a world that had ignored their suffering for so long. The broken system. In the immediate aftermath, there was an outpouring of support. Donations flowed in, officials made promises. California's government vowed to protect the children and ensure their rehabilitation. But in the years that followed, reports revealed a different story, one of bureaucratic failure and institutional neglect. In 2021, an ABC News investigation discovered that some of the Turpin children had been placed in abusive foster homes environments where they faced new traumas like sexual assault, forced punishment, and medical neglect. Others were homeless, without access to the funds that had been donated for their care. Despite millions raised in their name, several children said they struggled to afford food, housing, and even basic necessities. One survivor shared, "We went from hell to hope, back into confusion. We felt forgotten again." Officials blamed red tape. Some funds were locked in trusts. Others couldn't be accessed without specific paperwork or court orders. The system meant to protect them failed them again, this time out in the open. Family, but fragmented. After the rescue, the siblings were separated. The minors went into foster care. The adults were placed in supervised apartments or group homes. Though this was meant to help them individually, it tore apart the bond that had kept them alive. They had relied on each other in the house. Now they were strangers in new environments, scattered across different counties, forced to learn independence without the only support system they had ever known. Some reunited years later. Others still remained distant, not from lack of love, but from the mental toll of trauma. One survivor explained, "We were all dealing with the past in different ways, and sometimes being around each other made the memories stronger." Healing, it turns out, isn't always about togetherness. Sometimes it's about distance, time, and space to breathe again, rebuilding identity. Despite the odds, many of the Turpin children began rebuilding their lives. One enrolled in a university, pursuing a career in psychology, hoping to help others overcome trauma. Another discovered a love for music and began writing songs about survival. A third learned to drive, a seemingly ordinary act that represented control, freedom, and movement. They celebrated their first birthdays. They took trips to libraries, parks, and museums. They asked questions. They laughed cautiously at first, then freely. Some got jobs. One started volunteering at an animal shelter. A few opened up on social media, slowly finding their voice. For many, the goal wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. To take back the years stolen from them. To define themselves outside of the prison they were born into. The interview that shook the world. In 2021, two of the sisters, Jordan and Jennifer, sat down for a national television interview. It was the first time the public saw their faces, heard their voices, and witnessed their strength. Jordan, who escaped and called 911, described her fear on that night. "I didn't even know what a police officer was, but I knew if I didn't get out, someone was going to die." Jennifer talked about learning how to cook, make friends, and read novels, things she never imagined for herself. Through tears, they spoke about forgiveness, healing, and the will to live. Their courage ignited a new wave of support and a hard look at how society treats survivors once the headlines fade. Moving forward, never forgetting. Today, many of the Turpin children live private lives. Some are thriving. Others are still healing. Some may never fully recover, and that's okay. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't come with a timer or a guarantee. But one thing is certain, they are no longer prisoners. They are no longer chained to beds, no longer silenced, no longer invisible. They are free, and they are telling their story not to relive the pain, but to ensure no child suffers in silence ever again. There are stories that disturb us. There are stories that haunt us. But then, there are stories that change us. The Turpin case should be more than a headline. It should be a wake-up call, a reminder that monsters don't always hide in forests or wear masks. Sometimes they live behind trimmed hedges and clean smiles. Sometimes they wave at neighbors. And sometimes they're the people who call themselves parents. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to The Untold Trace. We bring you the stories that were hidden, the voices that were silenced, and the truths that the world must not forget.